So at this point, I would normally turn things over to Trish, our leader, but she's actually had a death in the family, so please keep her in your thoughts. I'm going to do my best to fill in her shoes. So I'll start by doing our introduction. We're joined this month by Anne-Marie Stieritz. Anne-Marie was named President and CEO of Liberty Fellowship in 2019. She joined Liberty Fellowship as its inaugural Chief Impact Officer in 2017, having served as President and CEO of the South Carolina Council on Competitiveness for 3 years. Anne-Marie's other professional roles include the University of South Carolina Executive Director for the Office of Economic Engagement, Vice President for Economic and Workforce Competitiveness of the South Carolina Technical College System, and Founding Director of the nationally recognized Apprenticeship Carolina Initiative. Long committed to global engagement, Anne-Marie previously worked as the Vice President of, and I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly, the Pohnpei Agricultural and Trade School in the Federated States of Micronesia, and with the Peace Corps in the Islamic Republic of Mauritania. She also served as a political analyst for the Consulate General of Japan in New York and as an international trade associate for the state of New Jersey. Anne-Marie has served on numerous professional and volunteer boards throughout her career. She is currently a member of the Board of Directors and Executive Committee of the Columbia Museum of Art, a member of the Tiffany Circle of International Red Cross and Red Crescent Movement, chair of the South Central SC chapter of the Tiffany Circle of the American Red Cross, and an inaugural member of the governing board of the newly founded national nonprofit Apprenticeships for America, and a member of the President's Advisory Council for Xavier University. Anne-Marie received her master's in politics and her MA in French studies from NYU. She also received a degree from the Sorbonne, and her BA is in history and French with a summa cum laude from Xavier University. She is a Liberty Fellow herself from the class of 2016 and an Aspen Institute certified moderator. So at this point, I'm going to turn things over to Anne-Marie, and she'll give us a little bit of background about who she is, her leadership journey, and what wisdom she would like to share with us.
Thank you, Emily. I appreciate it. And it's wonderful to see so many women gathered here today. I'm grateful that you've chosen to spend your time here this afternoon. I know we all have decisions to make about where and how we spend our time. So thank you for including me in your day today. As Emily said, my name is Anne-Marie Stieritz, and I currently serve as President and CEO of an organization called Liberty Fellowship. We are the premier leadership experience in the state of South Carolina. We are affiliated with the Aspen Institute in Washington, D.C., though we are not a part of the Aspen Institute. We are incorporated here in South Carolina, and we run a 2-year program for leaders in the state, intentionally designed to encourage civil discourse and dialogue in the state. It is a 2-year program that many of our leaders across the state have participated in. We are sector agnostic. We believe in bringing together leaders from across political parties, from government, from the private sector, nonprofits, but it is a selective process. We choose 20 leaders every 2 years, and it is a fully funded program for those that we select to participate. So there's a lot more information to give on that, but I am always pleased to have the invitation to talk a little bit about leadership. And I hope, I had asked Emily if we'd have an opportunity to be a little more conversational today, just because we're a smaller group. So I hope we can do that. And I don't mind being interrupted with questions or others. So please do feel free. I hope we can have some back and forth and some interactions. The first thing that I would start off with is in asking to do this, I'll probably talk a lot as Emily came down, or as Emily expressed just through the official bio, that much of what I'll discuss will be probably professional related and related to career paths and others. But I really do believe that leadership actually is not just leading an organization or leading professionally. It is also the fact that you are leading people, and that one of the most important aspects of leadership is actually self-leadership, of how do you guide yourself, how do you find your moral grounding, and how do you find your core values against which you are measuring your choices and your decisions and how you interact with others. Um, so while I set that as a framework, because I know I'll probably talk a lot about positional leadership or experiences, but recognize that it's much broader than that. And I'm sure everyone on this call is coming from a very different place of leadership that you're looking for or looking to perhaps pursue. So thank you for that. As you could probably detect from from Emily's introduction, my professional path has not been a linear one. Gratefully so, when I'm often asked to advise young women or speak at career related events, I say, I'm not sure I'm actually who you want. I said, I haven't been the 5-year plan person. I haven't been that. But for me, it served me well because I learned a lot about myself that way. And the sense is that I didn't necessarily plot it out beginning to end. So, well, hopefully not finished yet, but had an opportunity to have varied experiences that I think it's only in retrospect that I'm starting to understand what those common through lines were that was attractive throughout that. And I'm sure those who are at later points in their careers understand some of that. It looks a little different as you move further along the path. But one of the things that I would say in tandem with my introduction about leadership not just being positional or organizational, one of the very early lessons that I learned in leadership from a mentor and actually a sponsor, a man who served as my boss for many years. But one thing of advice, and I share this very often, is that keeping a distinction between yourself and your organizational position and title. And concretely, one of the things that he taught me that I share very often is he would not say, I am the president of XYZ, but rather I serve as. So not only as kind of a gesture of recognizing that you are part of a continuum in that, but also a sense of not getting too absorbed in that is your entire identity, but finding that way to just as you're phrasing that or saying to say that. So I very much try to keep that in mind in my own leadership, to not always identify myself with the job. And as you can tell from, again, from Emily's introduction, that was probably a good thing in my case, since I've made so many moves. But I would explain those moves by saying what has been helpful to me has been very much always looking for opportunities to say yes and stepping in. I know this is one thing that we very much talk about, particularly with women running for office, which is just because you don't think you can do it or you haven't done it before doesn't mean you can't. And that opportunity to put yourself forward, particularly when it comes to the ideas of elected office. And I'm thrilled, Emily, to hear about all the resources that SC WIL has put out for that. I deal with many women who consider running for office, who serve in office, both elected and appointed. We actually refer to WIL's database often when we have women who are looking for opportunities. So yeah, thank you, Emily. We often get asked, is there a list somewhere of all the boards and commissions where they need appointments where we could target putting people? I said, yes, there is. We don't need to invent that for ourselves. It already exists. So it's a wonderful resource. And thank you for prioritizing it. But just in addition, just those nuts and bolts of what it really takes to run and the realities of it, everything from I've noticed in some of WIL's recent resource opportunities, things about let's actually talk about the financial situation of running and what's implied and what you've got to be prepared for in terms of that looks. And actually, in my opinion, if I can editorialize, how that's exclusive at some points in determining who is actually able to put themselves in those positions to run. The other is recognizing childcare arrangements and the need for building out a support system around you. I myself do not have children. That's a choice my husband and I made. However, it is tremendously impactful. And of course, now we're talking more openly about that. So seeing SC will include that as understanding that's something unique. Often to women, to parents in general, but does affect women in certain ways, and particularly how you're viewed. I think when you are running for office and understanding that consideration. So a shout out to that. So as I said, those opportunities to say yes and to put yourself out there. I've been fortunate in looking for those, even when they didn't seem to make sense. I will say you talked about many women running for the first time and that experience sometimes of failure when you run the first time. I've made, if I look at that career path that was described, there were times on there when I thought I had screwed everything up. I thought this was the stupidest move I could have ever made. And in fact, right before we moved to South Carolina, my husband and I were overseas. We had moved overseas in a volunteer capacity. This is when we were in Africa and then in the Pacific region. We were in our mid-30s, and I thought we left mid-career in the US. And I thought when we were getting ready to come home, I thought, what am I ever going to do with this? And how am I ever going to translate it into anything that makes sense? And we came back and we moved to South Carolina. We're not originally from here. We moved to South Carolina. I knew no one, did not have a job when we relocated to South Carolina. We came because of my husband thing. And the work that I was doing overseas turned out to open every single door for me in South Carolina, because the work that we were doing was running an academic and technical high school. And it was right at the time in the state, which we still are, talking very much about how do we identify career paths? How do we help students and others? I'm watching Judy from Greenville Tech nod her head. How do we help students identify career paths? How do we look? And coming from a country where truly these students were literally building their country, and their parents and grandparents had built their countries through infrastructure, through education, through training, to then come to South Carolina when we were at a point of talking about, and still are, of course, it's a never-ending discussion of how do we prepare young people for the future and equip them to be able to deal in this and therefore move the state forward. All of that turned out to play exactly right. So that idea of you took the risk, you thought you might have made a mistake in doing it, but the lessons that are able to be taken from that, and that's certainly not the first time that had happened to me. I think another thing, and I'm thinking particularly knowing SC Will's focus on running for office, is very much a big part of that is who you surround yourself with. A very useful exercise that I encourage our Liberty Fellows to do. So these are leaders all over the state, but also others, is, and some of you may be familiar with this concept, but constructing for yourself a personal board of directors. And the idea of this is finding a few individuals that you can put around you who usually, ideally, don't necessarily have a stake in the outcome of a decision or something that you're doing, but to whom you can go and let them serve as providing feedback to you in a non-biased way in terms of really objectively. So one of the exercises that we often do is take a particular specific problem scenario or decision that you're struggling with. You have 5 minutes to discuss it out loud in a small group. Then others have 20 minutes to give you feedback on what that is, and then can ask questions at the end. So the structure of that, first of all, requires you to figure out and really consider what is the decision I'm making or what is the problem I'm wrestling with. And then you have to be quiet while others give feedback and listen to it. So you have to just take it as it is and resolve it. And then you can ask questions at the end, but it's It's an exercise that I've found particularly useful because one of the other lessons that I learned along the way is that I need to learn how to take feedback better. I get very defensive sometimes about feedback. I'm sure I may not be alone, but learning that, because what I've really come to realize is that sometimes, we talk a lot about the importance of mentorship. I actually don't believe I was a good mentee early on. I don't think I was ready for the mentorship and understanding the constructive nature of feedback, simply because I don't think I was in the mindset of understanding that's constructive and not being defensive about it. A little hubris, of course, involved in that, and ego, I think, in my perceptions of that, but learning to do that. But I've found that extremely helpful to solicit honest feedback. And as part of that, one of the things that I've also done, I love this phrase that I've come across, but it describes so well. And that is the idea of having a loyal antagonist. And that is, I have learned, and I proactively do this now, much of it because of what we do in Liberty Fellowship, to be frank. I have cultivated relationships, trusting relationships with individuals that I know think entirely differently from me. And therefore, when I have a decision to make or I have something I'm wrestling with, I proactively call them and ask them, how would you respond to that? How would you hear what I'm saying? How is that? And I have several of those people that I use in different ways. Actually, one of whom serves in the General Assembly, who I do call at a personal level, not necessarily on policy issues or anything like that, but keeping that person that can, first of all, keep me curious, keep me honest, but also it lets me know what might I be up against in making this, because it doesn't mean I have to agree with what the person's telling me, but at least I've sought it out and at least I know. So whether viewing it for refining my own position or viewing it just as I need to be prepared for what I'm not seeing in this. I came across the phrase the loyal antagonist and absolutely loved that because it described exactly, I think, that role of actively seeking someone to play that role for me. Emily, I've kind of been counting on you to look at time. So I don't know, I feel like I've talked a lot, and I certainly, as I said, would love us to be more conversational and be able to respond, to expand, to hear others' experiences, quite frankly, on some of this as well.
So everyone feel free, you can unmute yourselves, ask any questions you may have. If you're in a situation where you can't ask a question or make a comment, please feel free to use the chat. I can read those aloud. And I do have a starting off question for you, Anne Marie.
Sure.
Can you talk about what Liberty Fellowship hopes to accomplish long-term by cultivating leaders, and also some of your former fellows, so people can understand like the types of leaders you are cultivating?
Yeah, of course, of course. Yes, Liberty Fellowship, we are in our 20th year. Actually, we're celebrating our 20th year this year. And Liberty Fellowship was founded on the idea that South Carolinians have more in common than we differ from each other, but that we've really constructed a lot of silos. We only socialize with those in our own groups. We only, know who we know, we don't. So we intentionally, when we select fellows, we assemble what we call a mosaic. So when we are selecting 20 new fellows every couple years, we are selecting individuals that, first of all, are committed to the state, because a lot of this is we take individuals who've already achieved a level of leadership and recognized success. And it's then, okay, you've kind of achieved these things and perhaps reached these personal goals. So what are you going to do with it? We used to use the phrase from success to significance. You've become successful in whatever area you've chosen to operate and to lead, but what is the significance that you leave for others? And what is your role in moving South Carolina forward? We don't necessarily say what that has to be, but it's what is your role, and are you aware of the role that simply by virtue of sitting in the positions that you sit in, um, you are having an impact on life, and what do you want that to be? What should legacy be? So the concept, our founder, who was Hain Hip, if anyone is from the upstate area might know the Hip family or the Liberty Corporation. That's where our name comes from. It's not a value statement, Liberty. It's actually comes from the Liberty Corporation, that this was one of the legacies that he left to the state, was the idea of infusing what we call values-based leadership into the bloodstream of South Carolina. So the idea is to establish a network of leaders across the state that may not agree with one another, but will respect each other and recognize ourselves as fellow South Carolinians. So Emily had asked me to give a few examples. I'm trying to think of some of the women. We have a few women running for office. Tamika Isaac Devine just won. Hope Blackley has just announced. Tim Scott is a Liberty Fellow. Catherine Templeton, who just announced down in District 1 for Congress, is a fellow. Jamie Harrison, head of the DNC right now, is a fellow. I'm giving you political examples, but should also say we have 3 fellows that are within Michelin North America, one of now who is back in France, actually. We have fellows, Jill Davis or others within leadership at Blue Cross Blue Shield. Some of those we've just accepted a new class of fellows that will begin what we call their seminar experience with us. Will begin in March. A number of different leaders there, a number from the Charleston region, the head of Spoleto, Mina Hanna, if any. We always like to have an artist or artistic perspective in there as well. Again, brings a very different purview sometimes into our conversations and thinking about what do you believe the good society is, and how do we create that in South Carolina, and how do we develop mutual respect and trust across the cadre of leaders in the state. So Emily, has that helped?
Absolutely.
You may have touched on it a little bit.
Deborah,
Hi,
how are you?
Ann. How are you?
I'm good. Good to see you.
So good to see you. But you and a lot of women are credentialed and have lots of bona fides to support your efforts. What do you say to those women? And I'm sure it's all about a will thing too. What do you say to those women who are not certain that where they are in their lives or what they possess is sufficient to be a leader or to run for office or to serve on a board and commission?
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate the question. And we struggle with this a lot. To be perfectly honest, it's a question within Liberty Fellowship, is this question of where, like at what level. I don't even like to say that, but where are we focusing, and even the title of a leader? Because leadership shows up in very different ways, in very different contexts, which I guess kind of goes back to my sense of the positional title. So I think some of it is, I hesitate a little bit to use that because the expressions that I'm using are very much focused on positional power. And I think this is a positive. I think we're struggling with this socially, but I do think there's now wider acceptance of what kinds of models of leadership can be effective and how that looks different than perhaps what we've been used to. And I think we're in this difficult shift, perhaps right now, just societally and certainly in the state, of what might that look like. So I think for those women who are kind of less confident or less sure, feel that they aren't bringing some of those typical, as you've said, Deborah, credentials to the table. I think a good piece of it is finding those who can work with you and really do a resource assessment. Things that we often don't think of as resources actually very much are. And I know that's easily said than done. It's easy for me to sit here and say it. But I think that honest assessment of what resources do you have? Your networks through different types of organizations, different types of just interactions, anything through children's schools, through other types of things. But the reality is you will have to put yourself out there and you'll be asked about it. So doing that personal self-assessment and thinking through what that is an absolutely necessary part of the question. I don't think we should sugarcoat the fact that it will come up and some of those questions will be raised. And we understand that's the reality, the situation, and the bias in there of who can be a leader and what does a leader look like. I think it's being very conscious of that. The other thing that I think is important, and this is where SC-WIL, I think, plays an important role as well, is what other women who may be in those positions who do carry some of those credentials can validate you. That can carry a lot. And even, I would even say, not even just women, men as well. I think that idea of validating other women or women who are stepping out or taking on something that's uncomfortable. I think that, again, who do you surround yourself with and how might we? And that's an opportunity, where SC-WIL steps in, is who are women that are thinking about this that we might not otherwise know? And how do we welcome and bring in a culture of belonging so that they feel prepared to take that step and to put yourself out there? It's not an easy choice if we're specifically talking about elected office. And certainly even appointed office now. We're seeing a lot of that landscape changing as well. Deborah, is that helpful?
It's very helpful. And what we're saying at WIL also is that having that confidence to step out there, it's from local all the way to the top. Even when you want to get a promotion at your job, how you feel about yourself, how confident you are in yourself may determine whether you will even go for it or not. And if you do, how you would present yourself.
I think that's really accurate, Deborah. And I think it's also really, but it's easy for us to tell someone they need to raise their confidence. That's not always an easy thing to do. And a lot of times, a bit of, I think, the cycle here is that often it's only by taking the action that you actually gain the confidence. So you gain confidence through acting many times. So I think that's, I don't think we should be remiss, particularly with other women, of stating the words of needing to have more confidence, but truly understanding, where's that coming from and why does it happen? So.
Or being encouraging
Absolutely.
to other women.
Absolutely. Sure.
I have a question that kind of goes along that path in terms of non-traditional credentials.
Mhm.
Can you tell us a little bit more about your work with apprenticeships? I saw that you work with both Apprenticeship Carolina and Apprenticeship for America. And I feel like a lot of people focus on traditional, like collegiate pathways and career pathways, and
Sure.
apprenticeships don't get enough attention.
I appreciate that, and happy to talk about that. Yeah, Apprenticeship Carolina actually was an initiative that came out of the state level Chamber of Commerce, which was, and what I appreciate about apprenticeship in particular, if I can speak directly to it, is apprentices are paid. So, and that can come at any stage of life. It can be used for someone to, we often think of them as youth, as ways to get youth into particular career pathways or alternative ways toward economic and social mobility. But it can also be used for others who are transitioning jobs or moving into different career paths, whether voluntarily or sometimes simply by circumstance. So one of the things that I like about it is, first of all, a company has to run an apprenticeship program, so they have to be vested in it. It's not a matter of, we provide credentials and then hope someone gets hired. It truly is a partnership with an employer of what that looks like. The other is that it is paid with very transparent pay increases as an apprentice moves up. We hear a lot, it is not to be concerned, technically, it's not to be confused with an internship, with unpaid internships in particular, that often can be exclusive if someone simply doesn't come from a background with the financial bandwidth to be able to take on unpaid experience gathering, depending on what there is. An apprentice is actually paid a wage, and as an individual attains certain levels within their career advancement, they end up advancing on a wage scale as they move up to it until they're fully certified. So Apprenticeship Carolina sits within our technical college system here in South Carolina. That's not the case in other states. But one of the things that we're looking at the national level and found is expanding access and making it easier for individuals across the U.S. We've looked at other countries and other models of who are, this is more part of their culture and has been more robust. The other thing, Emily, that I would really highlight too is one of the things that I think we did very right in South Carolina in launching this after many fits and starts is apprenticeship is also not just for traditional trades. It is for IT careers. It is for medical careers. It is for nurses, CNAs and nurses. And I should probably defer to Judy perhaps a little bit on this now in terms of what career opportunities and pathways are available. So the organization has changed somewhat in the years since I've led it, but conceptually that was very much what we were setting out, that it is, again, it's critical to providing individual opportunities for citizens of our state, but also critical for the state's prosperity to have different on and off ramps available to individuals in which employers are invested.
That is wonderful to hear. Does anyone else have any questions they want to unmute or throw in the chat for us? If not, I've got plenty to work through, but just want to give everybody else a chance.
I might have put you on the spot. Did I not talk enough? I felt like I was talking too much. So I was happy to, I'm happy to keep going if you would like.
So one question I have is something, oh, Amy, did you want to?
Well, I'm just so excited to hear from the educator point of view, just how that there are many paths to a different outcome. But one of the other things I'm also hearing, and again, I love the word that you use, sector agnostic. I think that's a really great idea. One of the things I'm hearing from some of the young people that I'm working with is, especially in leadership, what they're looking at is not really what they want.
Yep.
And they could care less whether or not it is this party, that party. What they care about is policy and position.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm also looking at the people on this call, maybe Emily excluded, and going, there's only a certain demographic here of an age group here that and so how are we going to pull in that next generation for leadership? I love the idea of apprenticeship, but their views and how they're looking at the next thing is very different than some of us who are already sitting in here. So if you could speak to that a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Sure. And we'll certainly defer to anyone else that would like to weigh in on that. This is actually something within Liberty Fellowship that we have been thinking through. And is there an opportunity for us to, through Liberty Fellowship, which is not specifically professional training, so to speak, the way that apprenticeship is, but it's the idea of how do you think about leadership and cultivating, we call it leadership formation more than development. But yes, certainly, I mean, my personal opinion is yes, this kind of generational shift of perspective that is taking place very much has implications, and I do think it has implications broadly along the education spectrum, but also about how do you really, I phrase it as how do we prepare young people or hope to play a role in preparing young people when we actually, if we're honest with ourselves, do not know what this is going to look like on the other side? I mean, you don't. So what are the skills and tools that a young person today to be able to navigate a very changing and fluid environment? We're certainly seeing career tracks are going to be different. I think, my non-linear path, well, years ago was probably going to be more typical for young people entering careers now. It's the idea of staying with one employer and advancing within it is changing. So, which I also think has implications for leadership of where do you cultivate your own leadership and what does that mean if your kind of organizational context may change? So what do we, how do we think about that? The other is, I think, in where we really place the emphasis within Liberty Fellowship, even with our leaders, the average age of those of Liberty Fellows when they're accepted into the program is 41. So we're looking for folks that have some experience, have some life skills, and are kind of at this life questioning point of, where's this going? But I think one of the things that we're realizing is this ability to engage in civic discourse, and whether you call that leading teams that have diverse values, whether that is, I mean, you could use the term emotional intelligence. Is that what it is? I mean, these kinds of skills that unfortunately got lumped into the soft skill classification are actually very human skills and human attributes in terms of how do you interact with others, how do you motivate others, how do you inspire others. So I think getting a handle on that, I'm not saying I have the key, but I would say within the work that I do now with Liberty Fellowship, it very much is a focus on that. We say it gets to a point where you realize at a point in your leadership journey that actually the problems you're dealing with are not technical problems. They're human problems. And that requires a different kind of facility and comfort to develop and nurture, including checking yourself and what that looks like, but that ability to talk across difference. I may not be being specific enough for you, Amy, in terms of what you had in mind, but is that?
I think you've hit it. And again, looking at a 3-year gap, I have been in Liberia and trained teachers during after a civil war, and you're looking at these gap years of when tragedy has happened. We're looking at that with a pandemic. So we've got this gap year, but now we also have that greatest generation that may be coming out of that. How do we tap into that? How do we tap into that resiliency? How do we teach these soft skills, if you will, and apply that in a way that brings in these leaders differently? So I appreciate your answer. Thank you.
Sure, of course. And I think the other thing that for those of us on the call that do sit in positions of leadership, I think the other question for us is, do we create environments where that's cultivated and encouraged? It's one thing to say we'll teach it. It's another to welcome it in the places where we lead and find ourselves. So.
Can I tap off of what y'all are saying? What Amy said was really resonating with me and my experience. I have children in their early 20s, but what also resonates with me is that my generation has not been allowed to lead.
Can you say more?
When you look across, well, obviously right now at the national level, we're not allowed to lead. And one of the things that strikes me, I'm like constantly comparing, I'm a very strategic person, and you look at Ukraine and you look at the democracies in Europe that have really come into their own since the fall of the Berlin Wall and all that, which happened when I was, a lot younger, but remember it very clearly that those people that are my age had the opportunity to emerge into their countries as their countries found their own identity. Whereas we were not really allowed that opportunity because we already know what we're doing and we don't need your help. You just need to do what we have put in place for you to do. And I think what I just really want to take with me in the next 20 years is to not repeat that.
Mhm.
So maybe I don't get the chance to lead in that way, but I want the people who are going to be, I want everybody to have their chance. If that
Mhm.
makes sense. Yeah. Mhm.
I think I resonate. I saw Judy put something in the chat that I'm not familiar with, but did offer something to us all there. But Christy, oh, I see Audrey came off mute, so I'll.
I just wanted to say who Kimber Parker of YoPro know. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. She's based out of Greenville, but she does a lot of consulting work about how to basically what are millennials and Gen Z, how do they operate, how do they communicate, what are their values? And she's been very helpful to some of the organizations I'm involved with. Amy, you know her?
No, but I'm happy to hear the resource. Thank you.
Yeah, I can connect you.
Great. Thank you, Judy.
Anne Marie, when I was reviewing the
Christy, I
Liberty-
think the other point that you raised related, I'm thinking you and I may be the same age cohort as we're talking about these kind of generational divisions. I think we both fall in that Gen X. Okay. You know, we're just the ones that kept everything together, even if we weren't in charge of it. But it is the stereotype, I think, of this group. But I think what you raise is a really interesting point. It's another thing that I've become much more conscious of is the idea of knowing when, and I don't mean this directed toward anyone, and I think, and I'm referring to it more on a personal level, but the idea of knowing when it's not your time anymore and knowing when to step away from things. If I'm speaking of myself personally, it's ideas of, okay, I've played a role in an organization that got it to this point. Am I still the right person? Or does it need, you know, whether it's my skill set, whether it's a perspective, whether, but that idea sometimes is something that I try to remain very cognizant of do I have the energy for it? I mean, it's another thing when we're talking about self-leadership and care and how we think about those career steps or those life steps, I think. But that idea of, you know what, it's an ego blow, but maybe I'm not the right one anymore. And how do you do that? And how do you think about, how do you move into a different role then? What is the role? If any, and how do you clear the way? Which I think you're echoing that perhaps at a macro level of those tensions and questions, but I think they're very predominant leadership questions. I think that correct. I think we're feeling there is something generationally happening within the U.S. at this particular moment.
So when I was reviewing the Liberty Fellowship website, I saw a quote that I really liked. It said, fellows are expected to explore differing worldviews with an open mind and to challenge one another's ideas respectfully in conjunction with the fellowship's commitment to engaging a multitude of perspectives, which I think is a wonderful thing, especially in this day and age of, you know, polarization, vitriol. But how exactly do we respectfully challenge one another?
Sure. Yeah, it's become a growing question, I think. No, and one of the things that, if I speak specifically about Liberty Fellowship and the program, our approach is entirely based on moderated text-based dialogue, which means all participants have a text that we read in common that's meant to present tensions in values of different values, or we read two texts or say, And then we have a moderated discussion about it. One of the reasons we think the ideal format, or at least participation level, is between 18 to 23 people. And that's based on experience. And the reason that we do that is at 18 is kind of the threshold at which you get enough diversity of perspective to actually have a robustness of conversation that allows for the give and take. And we've also found if we get much higher than 23, you can't form the individual bases of trust that's necessary for those interactions to take place. So again, we're creating a bubble in which this happens. I mean, we recognize that very much, but it's this idea of, in that respect, I'm using the term civil discourse, but it really is how do we respectfully engage one another? How do we debate ideas, not people? How do we do this? So we very much create this, recognizing civil discourse is, or I've come to believe, is not necessarily a natural human tendency. It is something that is a practice, I think, that has to be honed, which is why our program is 2 years long, because we think it's that time of trust building, that time of listening and changes in life, and enough exposure and enough real time spent with individuals that you may not otherwise sit in rooms with, but with whom you develop a mutual respect. So there are kind of, and there are certain, let me also say, there are certainly circumstances in which civility and civil discourse does not mean there's no disagreement. And it doesn't mean seeking consensus. When we use that term, what we're meaning is there is a mutual learning that's going on about whatever topic, issue, whatever is being discussed. The idea is not that everyone walks out and disagrees. In fact, disagreement is where we can actually grow and learn. But if it's done in a respectful way, that's acknowledging. But it doesn't mean everybody, it's not about winning someone over. But where I was going with that is there certainly are circumstances where I would say, but I do think it strengthens your argument what are the best arguments on the other side? And how do you respond to them? I mean, that helps you think through your own case, whether that's making the case for yourself or whether that's making the case in other contexts. I think if you've gone through that rigorous of a thought process, it certainly can be helpful.
I like what you were saying about it's not necessarily an inherent trait, it's something that's learned. And I think it's something that we as voters also need to start exercising, is not rewarding it when we see like the disrespectful discourse, and exercising our own bit of respect by choosing leaders whose values align with that.
I appreciate your saying that, Emily, because I also think I've said this a few times is, and I've started to do this more recently with as we bring in new classes where I actually distribute a set of principles around civil discourse and understanding. I didn't used to feel the need to do that. I do because I felt they were assumed. And that may have been wrong at that time. That may have been a wrong assumption. But it's like putting it front and center on the table of, here's what this means to be sitting in this setting together. But to your point, I think particularly in electoral politics, and again, we're not solving the problem by describing it, but I think many, and I would include, we've talked about young people and bringing up others along. It's not incented behavior now to behave in that way. It's not, as you said, it's not rewarded. So to do it, and I think to truly engage in it now, it requires thought and commitment, and there could be a price for it. So,
I want to share something with everyone because it sounds like we're having this great conversation with women. And Christy Birch uh, has a salutation on her letter, which says from poet Adrian Rich. And I love it. It just sang to me. The connections between and among women are the most feared, most problematic, and the most potentially transforming force on the planet. I believe that. I believe women will save the world. That's why I do what I do, because I think women have the capacity to do everything we've talked about here, which is to have that conversation that leads to some type of consensus, or have the willingness to do that. And listening to what you're saying now, it just reinforces that to me. That's it.
thank you, Deb. Emily, anything else you'd like us to pull out or refocus on?
Yeah, so I think
I don't know if I've addressed it was lead like a woman. I don't know if I've addressed kind of that context or not. So,
I think you have. I have one last question, and it kind of pulls on some experience that Will's having recently.
Yeah.
I know Liberty Fellowship is nonpartisan, and what
absolutely.
Opportunities does that present, but also challenges? I know we at
Mhm.
Women in Leadership are multi-partisan, and we've had some pushback from people saying, I don't want to work with your organization because I only support Republicans or I only support Democrats.
Yep.
So I know that's a challenge we're struggling with internally.
Yeah. Again, this goes back to, we're not incentivized right now to kind of talk to others that may not agree with us. No, we've been very clear about that from the beginning. And actually, I think if you looked at our roster of fellows, you can see, I mean, we've lived it, been able to do that in terms of thinking about who in this kind of collective community have we assembled and how intentionally we've done that. I say we are not interested in creating echo chambers. In fact, farthest from the truth actually is what we're interested in, to the extent that people are interested not in debate but in actually learning from one another. The other thing that I would say for Liberty Fellowship is we actually take no policy positions or anything like that. So we say Liberty Fellowship does not act, its fellows do. So the fact that we ourselves do not actively engage in issues, it doesn't mean we don't with our fellow inform or bring together things, but the fact that we remain, and it is very difficult because anything you put out could be misinterpreted as falling one way or another, even unintentionally. It can be seen that way even if it's only meant to stir dialogue or stir, like I said, stir learning or information. It's just the context in which we're in right now. So I have a strong appreciation for that. All I'd say is, obviously, because it's the work that I'm in, I feel strongly that we need places of convening that do try. And it's also, is that both siderism? Is that giving in? Where are the boundaries? What is it? I mean, all of those things, and we wrestle with them very much by trying to say, we can create the framework for what individuals decide to bring in, but they have to be coming in with the right intentions. But it is difficult, but I would argue there are a few places. And I will say when I interview, we have a pool of about 400 individuals that are eligible at any given time for Liberty Fellowship. And when I engage in those interviews, there is a real desire to find someplace to be able to engage in conversations across whatever divide we decide there is. So So kudos, I say. I know well, and I will say for me, honestly, one of the reasons WIL was appealing to me was because I felt like that was part of what it was doing. It was working on democratic processes. It was working on our democratic institutions and solutions, and particularly engaging women in that. So that's a personal statement on my part where I felt very comfortable in that because I think that's I don't know that that's uniquely female, but I certainly respect the focus on women. But the idea of democratic institutions, civic engagement, engagement in civic life, and the fact that that could happen in I think you all use the term multi-party context. Absolutely. Just the term multi-party. Congratulations.
All right, well, I think we have a couple minutes. I just have one last question to kind of wrap everything up since it is the Lead Like a Woman group. Over your career and maybe your work through the fellows, how has it changed your perception of what it means to both be a strong leader and what it means to be a woman leader?
Wow, that's an interesting question. I think those two go in tandem, actually, now that I think about it, if I'm talking from my personal perspective. Certainly early in my career, as the models that I saw, I think I was likely less authentic in thinking that made me stronger, if that makes sense. I've become much more comfortable being much more open and transparent about what I'll say yes and no to. I think in a lot of ways, and yeah, it's as I said, I think this goes back to my comment earlier, Emily, where I said I think we are starting to recognize that leadership can look different than what the model has been that's always been there for us. And I don't just mean physically in terms of men, I just mean, but leadership, there's a new respect. I'm not saying we're there yet, but I do think there is a new respect for different leadership styles and different leadership approaches that can be much more holistic than what we have. And I think I certainly can recognize times when I was in a role or a position where I realized I truly was not bringing my whole self to the position. And I feel more comfortable doing that. I'm still not a bring your whole person to work kind of advocate. I still come out of a generation that's a little hesitant on some of that, but I do feel much more confident leading in that way and kind of not being a self-conscious. Some of that's age, though, I will have to say, as many of us on the call can appreciate. I think
it takes a level of bravery too. There's a protection in not bringing your whole self. You have some barriers there.
Sure.
Well, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. It's been wonderful. We've gotten some great feedback in the chat. And
great.
Everyone, we'll see you again next month, and we'll be joined by Melissa Enos. She is a councilwoman for the city of Goose Creek, also served in the military and was a hairdresser for years, which I think is a great transition from a non-traditional career path to elected office. So thank you so much, everyone, and have a great day.
Thank you.